I'm Rob Jolliffe, and this is a Sabre Limited expert series on the biggest failures of a manufacturing ERP implementation. So this is 6 big manufacturing ERP implementation mistakes. I want to look into things that cause ERP implementation failures, especially in manufacturing ERP. My name is Rob Jolliffe. I'm an expert in Business Central, Microsoft Dynamics Business Central ERP systems, and in particular in manufacturing. So let's jump in and take a look at these implementation mistakes. There's a couple of assumptions that I make. The company that we're talking about is going to be a mid-sized manufacturer, so $5 to $100 million in annual revenue. It's a mid-market ERP. It's not SAP or Oracle. It's not QuickBooks or Sage. And you've experienced a bad implementation. So of my 6 reasons, and these are the top 6 that I could think of, number 1 is that not understanding the mode of manufacturing was part of the failure reason. I've written a blog on this, which is on our sabrelimited.com site, but I define 8 modes of manufacturing. Those modes of manufacturing are basically the methodologies or the styles of manufacturing processes and the supply chain processes that drive them. And those drive the ERP system. So depending on which one of these that you fit into will define which parts of the ERP system you should be using. And so if those modes of manufacturing weren't being considered by the team when they were implementing, which is very common in a couple of circumstances, one of which is that the consultants themselves didn't have experience in multiple different modes of manufacturing. So they had trouble distinguishing which mode of manufacturing you were. That's just typical of non-manufacturing, non-supply chain implementers. So people with more of a financial background implementing ERP. The other possibility is that you have staff who have worked in other modes of manufacturing before, and they've only used ERP in those other modes of manufacturing. You aren't using an ERP today. So in those cases, there's a mismatch because they see how it was done at their previous employer and they try and cookie cutter that in. And that's where modes of manufacturing are really critical. And I would say that if no one considered the best practices for your mode of manufacturing, that's a tell of an ERP implementation failure. That's one of the main reasons why they fail. If your team customized instead of learned, or instead of changing the business processes, I think that's a big failure reason. This is my number 2 failure reason. It typically happens when your team second guesses the ERP system, so they don't understand it, and they just think, well, the ERP doesn't match our business. But keep in mind, most mid-market ERP systems have a lot of practice. Just to give you an example, Microsoft Dynamics Business Central and its predecessor product, NAV, which is really the same product with a slightly different user interface, they have more than 130,000 combined customers. Now, not all of them are manufacturing, but enough of them are manufacturing that the bugs are being worked out. And the argument by an implementation team that, well, our ERP can't handle our business type because we're weird or we're special and super unique, that generally causes a lot of problems. And it leads to trying to customize your way out of the standard best practices in the ERP and try and make it so that you've created your own ERP system. And as soon as you've done that, you back yourself in a corner. You typically have painted yourself into a corner. So if you chose to avoid learning the ERP in favor of changing the ERP, that is a typical sign of a mistake made in an ERP implementation. If the ERP was not taken seriously and we cut corners in the implementation, that's another sign that I see of one of the mistakes of a big ERP failure. So if your team didn't take the ERP project seriously and they looked at the ERP project as just another piece of software, like an upgrade of Microsoft Office, that will cause this type of problem because ERP is going to have changed your entire business, which you will have learned after you've turned it on and discovered that it wasn't set up and configured the way you expected it. It virtually impacts every single employee in the organization. And so if you've cut corners to save time or cost during the project, or you were cutting corners, then it probably had the opposite effect, and you probably ended up with a big problem, much bigger problem on your hands when you were done. If you had the wrong team, and that can either be that you have the wrong people or you have too many people, both of those seem to cause problems with ERP projects, and they tend to be mistakes that we see made. So junior staff implementing those business transformational portions of the project that we just talked about before with the cutting corners, and how by the time you go live, the staff are finding that it doesn't work for your business. Junior staff can be a big part of that problem. It can kind of go hand in hand with the cutting costs and cutting corners and not taking the project seriously. But you may have been very serious about the project, but thought that junior employees could do the work, and they can't usually because they just don't know the business. Or the other problem, and I mentioned it earlier, is that you had too many people involved in the project, and you had too many cooks in the kitchen, as the saying goes. And so nobody could agree on the right approach. And this typically happens when team members from other departments are intermixed. So I've seen it in a purchasing environment where engineers who do a little bit of purchasing and the AP team who needs to kind of understand the basics of purchasing are brought in and made equal partners in the implementation of the ERP in the purchasing department. And that is not a good way of going. If you're going to have people partnering with the purchasing department to make decisions, they should be the supply chain and manufacturing teams, not the accounting and engineering teams, because they do a little bit of purchasing, but purchasing doesn't affect them nearly as much as it does those other departments. So having the wrong people and having too many cooks, too many people with their opinions is a bad sign. The last thing I would say is, if the line managers, and this gets back to the previous discussion, if the line managers in their departments didn't have buy-in into the implementation, then that typically is a big problem, because if they didn't make the decisions about their department, they're not going to own those decisions. And when they go live, they're going to be able to poke holes in all kinds of things that were done that they disagree with. So I think if you have an ERP, if you did not have an ERP team, if you set a group of individuals to work and you didn't bring them together and they weren't working as a team, that's also a problem. And that isn't so much that you had the wrong people or too many people. It may be that you had the wrong mix of people. This one is a real pet peeve of mine, and I see it a lot. If you had set an arbitrary deadline, and assuming you being a manager or the owner of the company, and had I don't care if we sync, it's your problem, for your staff, thinking, well, you're all going to be fired if this goes bad. That is a really bad model to implement, because ERP is going to transform your business, whether it's for the better or for the worse. And so if you've made the decision arbitrarily to set a deadline and said you have to stick to the deadline, whether it's ready or not, that's probably how you got where you are. So setting that arbitrary deadline is just like, maybe because you're frustrated by slow progress in the project, or maybe you think that it's taking too long. But you should not do that. You need to get better people, or you should have got better people and given them more time, and not back them into a corner, because what ultimately happens is they cut corners to get it live on time, and then you end up again with a failed implementation or a real problem. I would say this is my last bullet on these. This is my last cause of an ERP implementation failure: the lack of an executive sponsor. And this is a little different than the one that I was talking about earlier with having line managers involved in the project. The day-to-day, the executive team's time spent on day-to-day business and the project were unbalanced. And if that happens, then that tends to be a big cause of an implementation mistake that can cause an implementation to go badly. If those executives were not involved, they don't take ownership. The rest of the team sees that, and they treat it as if, well, this isn't that important. If the small business owner was not involved, the rest of the team treats it as, well, this isn't that important to the small business owner. And in a larger company, if there were no C-level executives involved in the project, and when I say involved, it doesn't mean that they have to be getting their hands dirty and getting it on the keyboard and the mouse and working on the project. But if those people weren't at all present, they just handed it off to a group and said, you do it, it's your problem, and completely walked away from it, that will generally lead to a failure for the project, because the rest of the team doesn't see their leadership. So let me summarize those 6 ERP mistakes that we see with customers coming to us after they've done an ERP implementation, or asking us what are the things that we need to look out for. So misaligned implementations with the mode of manufacturing, I think, is a really key one. The mode of manufacturing is if it's misunderstood, if it's not correctly applied, that probably causes more of the problems than we've seen elsewhere. As a matter of fact, that can cause the problem in bullet number 2, which is customizing the system rather than learning it, or before you've even learned it, not even bothering trying to learn the system, just saying we're going to customize it to suit what we need. Not taking the project seriously. If you don't take the project seriously, you're going to have a failure in your ERP, and that's a major mistake. Putting the wrong people on the project is a mistake that we see all the time. If you haven't put the right people on the project, you typically end up with a project that doesn't go where you expect it to go. Setting arbitrary dates on your project. When you have set an arbitrary date and given people a cutoff, if you found that you have an ERP project that hasn't gone well, especially if the go live was extremely rough and very, very painful for your team and lasted much longer than you expected it to, it very well may have been because of that. And the last is that if you had nobody from upper management, nobody from the executive team that was really involved in the project, like actually spending some time and finding out where it was. And tie breaking, I think tie breaking is a very important part of their job, because when there are 2 or 3 ways to do things and your team can't decide, it requires somebody at that high level to come in and be familiar enough with what's going on that they can make a decision while not necessarily having to be completely in the weeds. So as always, check out the links in the description for the article that I mentioned earlier and other videos and articles that are related to the subject. And remember to subscribe and follow our channel. We post videos like this fairly frequently. So if you would like to keep on top of the new videos that are coming out, just click that bell icon after you subscribe to be informed of new videos. We are Sabre Limited, and if you'd like to reach us, you can reach us at www.sabrelimited.com. You can reach me, or you can email me at sales@sabrelimited.com, and you can reach me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Rob Jolliffe. Have a great day.